Hello and welcome back to Science Lullaby. Tonight we're going to explore something truly extraordinary, something that's happening right now, in this very moment. As you listen to these words, we're going to talk about consciousness itself, the greatest mystery that science has ever encountered, the one phenomenon that refuses to give up its secrets. No matter how deeply we probe, no matter how sophisticated our instruments become, no matter how brilliant our theories, this is a journey into the most intimate aspect of your existence. The feeling of being you, the experience of experiencing. And as we drift through this mystery together, you might find yourself relaxing into the profound strangeness of it all. The wonder of awareness itself. So settle in. Get comfortable, and let's begin our exploration of consciousness. The greatest puzzle in all of science. There's the soft pressure of whatever you're resting on. Maybe the weight of a blanket, perhaps the gentle rhythm of your breathing, the sound of my voice reaching your ears. These aren't just physical processes happening in your body, they're experiences. They have a certain quality to them, a certain feeling, a what it's likeness. This is consciousness, and it's the most familiar thing in the world to you. It's been with you every waking moment of your entire life. You've never not known it. You've never experienced what it's like to be unconscious while you're unconscious. Because by definition, when you're unconscious, there's no one there to experience anything at all. Consciousness is as fundamental to your existence that you can't imagine what it would be like without it. And yet, despite this intimate familiarity, consciousness remains utterly mysterious. Science has mapped the human genome. We've split the atom. We've sent probes to the edge of our solar system and peered back billions of years to the origins of the universe itself. We understand the intricate dance of molecules that gives rise to life. We can predict the motion of planets with extraordinary precision. We've built machines that can compute faster than millions of human brains working together, but we still cannot explain in any satisfying way how 3 pounds of gray matter inside your skull produces the rich inner world of your subjective experience. Think about the color red for a moment. Imagine a brilliant red rose, or the deep crimson of a sunset, or the vibrant scarlet of a cardinal's wing. You know what red looks like. You've experienced it countless times. But here's the strange thing. Science can tell you everything about the physical basis of seeing red. It can tell you about the wavelengths of light, roughly between 620 and 750 nanometers, that we call red. It can explain how these photons bounce off objects and enter your eye. It can describe in exquisite detail how they strike the photoreceptor cells in your retina, specifically the long wavelength cones that are sensitive to reddish light. Neuroscientists can trace the signal as it travels from your eye along the optic nerve to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, and then onward to the primary visual cortex at the back of your brain. They can show you the cascade of neural activity that ripples through your visual system. They can even point to specific neurons that fire in response to red stimuli. They can create functional brain images that light up with color when you see something red, showing the activation patterns spreading across your cortex like ripples on a pond. But here's what all of that scientific knowledge cannot tell you: what it feels like to see red. The subjective quality of redness. The redness of red, if you will. This isn't just a gap in our current knowledge, something we'll figure out once we build better microscopes or develop more sophisticated theory. This is, many philosophers and scientists argue, a gap of a completely different kind, a gap that might be fundamentally unbridgeable. This is what makes consciousness special. It's not just complex. Lots of things are complex. A galaxy is complex. The global climate system is complex. The economy is complex. But we have at least a framework for understanding that complexity. We can break these systems down into components, understand how the components interact, build models, make predictions. And while we may not understand everything about these systems, we feel confident that we're on the right track. That given enough time and effort, we'll figure them out. Consciousness feels different. When we look at consciousness, we're not just dealing with complexity, we're dealing with something else entirely. Something that seems to resist the usual methods of scientific explanation. And this isn't because neuroscientists aren't trying hard enough, or because our brain scanners aren't powerful enough. It's because there seems to be something fundamentally different about subjective experience that makes it uniquely resistant to objective scientific analysis. Consider pain for a moment. Let's say you stub your toe. Science can tell you an enormous amount about what happens when you stub your toe. It can explain how the impact damages tissue in your toe, how this triggers specialized nerve endings called nociceptors, how these send electrical signals racing up your leg to your spinal cord, how the signals are then relayed to your brain, activating regions like the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. It can even tell you about the complex network of neural activity that constitutes the pain response. It can show you the brain scans that reveal this activity. It can measure it, quantify it, predict it. But what science cannot explain is why any of this should hurt. Why should certain patterns of neural activity be accompanied by that awful, sharp, unmistakable feeling of pain? The neurons are just fires. Electrical and chemical signals are cascading through networks of cells. These are physical processes, no different in principle from the electrical signals in a computer or the chemical reactions in a battery. So why should they feel like anything at all? Why shouldn't it all happen in the dark, so to speak? Why is there something it's like to be you, experiencing pain, rather than just a complex biological machine responding to tissue damage? This is the mystery, the hard problem, the seemingly impossible question. And it's not limited to exotic or unusual experiences. Every moment of your conscious life is filled with these inexplicable qualities. The taste of chocolate, the sound of music, the feeling of happiness or sadness or love, the visual experience of a starry night sky, the sensation of warm water on your skin. Each of these has a distinctive qualitative character. Each one feels like something, and science, for all its incredible achievements, cannot explain why. You might think this is just a problem for philosophers, lost in abstract speculation, but it's not. This is a practical question that touches on some of the most important issues we face. When does consciousness begin in a developing fetus? Are animals conscious? And if so, which ones? Should we be concerned about the welfare of chickens or fish or insects? As we develop more sophisticated artificial intelligence, will we eventually create conscious machines? And if we do, will they have moral status? Do they deserve rights? These aren't idle questions. They have real consequences for how we treat other beings, how we structure our society, how we think about our responsibilities. And on a more personal level, understanding consciousness matters because it's the very foundation of what makes your life meaningful. All the things you care about, all the joys and sorrows, all the beauty and wonder, all the love and connection you experience, all of it depends on consciousness. Without consciousness, nothing would matter. There would be no one there for it to matter to. So in a very real sense, consciousness is everything. and yet we don't understand it. This is where we find ourselves, standing at the edge of a profound mystery, a mystery that sits at the very center of our existence. And tonight, as you relax and prepare for sleep, we're going to explore this mystery together, not to solve it. No one has managed that yet, but to appreciate it, to marvel at it, to understand just how strange and wonderful it is that you exist as a conscious being, experiencing the world from the inside. The hard problem. In the year 1995, a young Australian philosopher named David Chalmers stood before an audience in Tucson, Arizona, and introduced a distinction that would reshape the way scientists and philosophers think about consciousness. He divided the problems of consciousness into two categories. He called them the easy problems and the hard problem. Now, when he used the word easy, his tongue was firmly in his cheek. The easy problems aren't easy at all. They're extraordinarily difficult. They might take us centuries to fully solve, but they are, in principle, approachable through ordinary scientific methods. What are these easy problems? They include questions like, how does the brain integrate information from different senses to create a unified experience? How do we focus our attention on one thing rather than another? How do we access and report on our own mental states? How does the brain control our behavior? How do we categorize and recognize objects in our environment? How does short-term memory work? Each of these is a complex question. Each requires careful experimentation, sophisticated theories, detailed observations. Neuroscientists are working on all of them right now, making progress, building models, understanding the neural mechanisms involved. These are called easy problems, not because they're trivial, but because we can at least see how to approach them. We can study the neural systems involved. We can observe what happens when different brain regions are damaged. We can watch brain activity using functional imaging. We can build computational models. We can make predictions and test them. We have a framework for investigation. We're dealing with functions, things the brain does, and we can study function. We can break them down into sub-functions, identify the mechanisms that perform them, understand how they work together. But then there's the hard problem. The hard problem is different. It's the question of why any of this should be accompanied by subjective experience at all. Why is there something it's like to integrate information? Why does accessing information feel like anything? Why should the brain processes involved in attention come with the felt quality of concentrating on something? Why should the neural mechanisms of memory be accompanied by the experience of remembering? Why, in short, should any physical process whatsoever give rise to consciousness? This is what Chalmers called the hard problem. And it's called hard because we don't even have a framework for approaching it. It's not just that we don't know the answer yet. It's that we don't know what kind of answer would even count as an explanation. Imagine a future neuroscientist with a complete map of every neuron in your brain, every connection, every electrical and chemical signal. Imagine they can watch in real time as information flows through your neural networks, as different brain regions activate and communicate. They can predict your behavior perfectly. They understand every computational process happening in your brain. But would that tell them what it feels like to be you? Would it explain the redness of red or the painfulness of pain? It seems like something would still be left out, namely the subjective experience itself, the what it's likeness. The philosopher Joseph Levine has called this the explanatory gap. No matter how detailed our third-person objective, physical description of the brain becomes, There seems to be a gap between that description and the first-person subjective reality of experience. To help illustrate this gap, philosophers have come up with various thought experiments. One of the most famous is called the philosophical zombie. Imagine a creature that is physically identical to you in every way, every atom in the same place, every neuron firing in the same pattern. This zombie behaves exactly like you. It talks about consciousness. It writes philosophy papers about the hard problem. If you poke it, it says ouch and rubs the spot where you poked it. By every observable measure, it's indistinguishable from a conscious human being. But here's the twist. There's nothing it's like to be this zombie. The lights are off inside. It's not having any subjective experiences at all. It's just a complex biological robot, mechanically responding to stimuli without any inner life. Now the question is such a zombie conceivable? Can we imagine such a thing without contradiction? Many philosophers, including Chalmers, say yes, we can conceive of it, and if we can conceive of it, that tells us something important. It tells us that consciousness is not logically entailed by physical facts alone, that there's something about consciousness that goes beyond the merely physical. Of course, not everyone agrees. Some philosophers and scientists argue that zombies are not really conceivable, or that even if they are, conceivability doesn't tell us anything about what's actually possible. Others argue that we're confused about the nature of consciousness, that the appearance of a gap is an illusion created by limitations in our thinking. These debates get extremely technical and nuanced, but they all circle around the same central mystery: the relationship between physical processes in the brain and subjective experiences in the mind. Another famous thought experiment comes from the philosopher Frank Jackson, and it's called Mary's Room, or sometimes the knowledge argument. Here's how it goes. Mary is a brilliant neuroscientist who has spent her entire life in a black and white room. She's never seen color, but she's studied the science of color vision extensively. She knows everything there is to know about the physics of light, about wavelengths and photons. She knows everything about the biology of the eye, about cones and rods and the optic nerve. She knows everything about the neuroscience of color perception, about which brain regions process color information and how they do it. She has complete physical knowledge about color vision. Then one day Mary leaves her black and white room and sees color for the first time. She sees a ripe tomato, brilliant red in the sunlight. The question is, does Mary learn something new? Does she gain knowledge she didn't have before? It certainly seems like she does. She now knows what it's like to see red. She has a new kind of knowledge, experiential knowledge, that she couldn't have gotten from all her physical and neuroscientific understanding. And if that's true, then there must be facts about consciousness, facts about what it's like to see red, that are not physical facts that can't be captured in a purely physical description of the world. Again, not everyone agrees with this conclusion. Some argue that Mary doesn't really learn anything new. She just experiences something she already knew about in a new way. Others argue that the thought experiment is flawed in various technical ways, but the intuition it captures is powerful. There does seem to be something about consciousness that resists reduction to purely physical terms. This is why consciousness is such a special problem for science. Science has been spectacularly successful at explaining the world in physical terms. We've shown that heat is molecular motion, that light is electromagnetic radiation, that life is chemistry, that heredity is encoded in DNA. We've reduced complex phenomena to simpler physical components and processes. This reductive strategy has been one of science's greatest strengths. But consciousness seems to resist this approach. You can't reduce the feeling of pain to neural firing in the same way you can reduce heat to molecular motion. There's a remainder, an explanatory gap, a hard problem. Some scientists and philosophers have suggested that maybe we need a radically new kind of scientific theory to explain consciousness. Not just better neuroscience, but a fundamentally different approach. Others have suggested that consciousness might be more widespread than we think, that it might be a basic feature of the universe, present even in very simple systems. This view, called panpsychism, suggests that consciousness doesn't emerge from complex physical systems, but is rather a fundamental property of matter itself, which combines and integrates in complex systems like brains to create our rich human consciousness. Still others think the hard problem is a confusion, that we're asking the wrong questions or making unwarranted assumptions about the nature of consciousness. They argue that once we properly understand the functions that consciousness performs, the hard problem will dissolve. The subjective character of experience will be explained by its functional role. But critics respond that this just ignores the hard problem rather than solving it, that it tries to explain away the very thing that needs explained. As you lie there drifting towards sleep, your own consciousness is gradually fading. The vivid clarity of waking experience is softening, becoming dreamlike. Thoughts are arising and dissolving without your direction. The boundary between self and world is blurred, and in a little while, if all goes well, your consciousness will disappear entirely into dreamless sleep. An entire universe of experience will simply cease to be, and then in the morning, it will return. The lights will come back on. You'll be you again, experiencing the world from the inside. This nightly cycle of consciousness and unconsciousness is itself remarkable. Where does consciousness go when you sleep? Does it gradually fade out, or does it switch off suddenly? What's the difference between dreamless sleep and death? From the perspective of experience, both are states of complete unconsciousness, and yet one is temporary, the other permanent. One you wake from, the other you don't. But in the moment of being unconscious, there's no difference at all. No experience of time passing, no sense of being, no waiting, no darkness even, just nothing. An absence so complete you can't even know you're in it. This is the territory we're exploring. The mystery of why there's something it's like to be you. Why you're not just processing information in the dark, why the lights are on inside. And despite all our scientific knowledge, despite all our theories and experiments and observations, this basic question remains unanswered. The hard problems stand, not as a challenge that will inevitably be overcome by future science, but as a deep puzzle about the nature of consciousness and its place in the physical universe. The physical brain. Even though we can't fully explain consciousness, neuroscience has made remarkable progress in understanding its physical basis. We know that consciousness depends on the brain. Damage to certain brain regions can profoundly alter or eliminate conscious experience. When someone suffers a stroke that destroys parts of their visual cortex, they can lose the experience of seeing, even though their eyes still work fine. The world doesn't just look different to them. Parts of it disappear entirely from their conscious awareness. There's a fascinating condition called hemispatial neglect, often caused by damage to the right parietal lobe. Patients with this condition completely ignore everything on their left side. They don't see things on the left. They don't hear sounds from the left.
If you put food on the left side of their plate, they won't eat it. Not because they can't reach it or aren't hungry, but because from their perspective it simply doesn't exist. They're not consciously aware of the entire left half of the world, and remarkably they're often not aware that anything is missing. Their conscious experience feels complete to them, even though from an outside perspective, half of reality has vanished from their awareness. Cases like this tell us something important. They show that consciousness isn't some vague, mysterious force that inhabits the brain. It's intimately tied to specific neural structures and processes. When those structures are damaged, consciousness itself is altered or diminished in very specific ways. This gives neuroscientists something to work with. They can study the neural correlates of consciousness, the minimum set of brain structures and activity patterns that are necessary and sufficient for a particular conscious experience. The search for these neural correlates has been one of the major projects of modern neuroscience. It was championed by Francis Crick, the same scientist who co-discovered the structure of DNA with James Watson, and his collaborator Christoph. They argued that rather than getting lost in philosophical debates about the hard problem, neuroscientists should focus on identifying the specific neural systems that give rise to consciousness. This is an empirical question that can be addressed through experiment, and they've made real progress. We now know, for instance, that the cerebellum, a large structure at the back of the brain that contains more than half of all neurons in the entire brain, doesn't seem to contribute directly to consciousness. You can damage the cerebellum and affect coordination and motor control, but conscious experience itself remains largely intact. Meanwhile, much smaller regions in the cerebral cortex seem to be essential for consciousness. Damage here can eliminate or profoundly alter conscious awareness. The thalamocortical system, the thalamus and its connections with the cerebral cortex, appears to be particularly important. The thalamus is like a relay station, a central hub that connects different parts of the brain. Nearly all sensory information flowing into the cortex passes through the thalamus first, and the thalamus maintains constant two-way communication with the cortex, creating complex feedback loops. This thalamocortical system seems to be critical for maintaining the kind of integrated, unified conscious experience we all have.
When this system is disrupted, consciousness fades. General anesthetics, the drugs that render you unconscious for surgery, work partly by disrupting these thalamocortical connections. They don't shut down the brain entirely. Individual neurons and brain regions continue to function, but the integrated communication between different parts of the brain breaks down, and consciousness disappears. Similarly, in dreamless sleep, activity in this system decreases dramatically. The constant back and forth communication that characterizes waking consciousness gives way to more isolated, local patterns of activity. Neuroscientists have also identified more specific neural correlates for particular conscious experiences. For visual consciousness, activity in the visual cortex at the back of the brain is crucial, but not just any activity. There's activity in the visual cortex that happens unconsciously. For instance, if you flash a visual stimulus very briefly, so briefly that you don't consciously see it, there's still activity in your visual cortex. Your brain is processing the information, but it's not reaching consciousness. For the information to become conscious, to be experienced, it needs to spread more widely through the cortex, activating a broader network of regions. This has led to influential theories about what makes some brain processes conscious while others remain unconscious. One prominent theory is the global workspace theory, proposed by Bernard Baars and further developed by neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene. According to this theory, consciousness arises when information is broadcast widely across the brain. Imagine a theater. Most of the brain's processing happens in the dark, backstage, unconsciously. But some information makes it onto the brightly lit stage, where it becomes available to many different brain systems. This broadcast information is what we experience consciously. When you consciously see something, hear something, or think about something, the neural representation of that information is being broadcast throughout your cortex, allowing many different systems to access it. This is why conscious information is so flexible and useful. You can talk about it, think about it, remember it, make decisions based on it. Unconscious information, by contrast, is more isolated. It might affect your behavior in specific ways, but it's not integrated into the broader functioning of your mind. The global workspace theory makes testable predictions. For instance, it predicts that conscious perception should be associated with widespread activation across the cortex, while unconscious perception should involve more localized activity. And brain imaging studies have generally supported this. When people consciously see a stimulus, there's activation not just in visual areas but also in prefrontal and parietal regions, spread across the brain. When the same stimulus is presented unconsciously, the activation is more limited, restricted mainly to sensory areas. Another influential theory is the integrated information theory, developed by Giulio Tononi and his collaborators. This theory takes a different approach. Instead of focusing on specific brain regions or types of neural activity, it focuses on the structure of information in the brain. According to this theory, consciousness is identical to integrated information. A system is conscious to the extent that it integrates information, that is, to the extent that what happens in one part of the system makes a difference to what happens in other parts. The theory uses a mathematical measure called phi, represented by the Greek letter phi, to quantify this integration. Systems with high phi, where different parts are strongly interdependent, are more conscious. Systems with low phi, where parts function independently, are less conscious or not conscious at all. Remarkably, this theory makes some counterintuitive predictions. For instance, it suggests that some very simple systems might have a tiny amount of consciousness, while some complex systems, like digital computers with feed-forward architectures, might have none at all because information flows through them without integration. These theories, global workspace theory, integrated information theory, and others, represent serious attempts to bridge the explanatory gap, to provide a rigorous scientific account of what consciousness is in physical terms. They've led to interesting experiments and have advanced our understanding. But the hard problem still lurks in the background. Even if we can perfectly predict when a system will be conscious based on its information integration or its global broadcasting, we still face the question, why should integrated information or global broadcasting feel like anything? Why should it be accompanied by subjective experience? But let's step back from these deep questions for a moment and just appreciate what neuroscience has achieved. We can now watch a human brain think. Using functional MRI, we can see blood flow changes that reflect neural activity. We can observe different brain regions lighting up as you see a face, hear music, recall a memory, feel an emotion, make a decision.
We can even to some extent decode what you're experiencing based on your brain activity. Neuroscientists have built models that can reconstruct images you're looking at based solely on activity in your visual cortex. They can tell with some accuracy what you're thinking about or what you're dreaming. We understand the neurotransmitter systems that modulate consciousness. We know that acetylcholine promotes wakefulness and attention. That serotonin influences mood and emotional consciousness. That dopamine is involved in reward and motivation. We can manipulate these systems with drugs and observe the changes in consciousness that caffeine blocks adenosine receptors, reducing drowsiness. Alcohol enhances GABA activity, producing intoxication and sedation. Psychedelic drugs like psilocybin and LSD affect serotonin receptors, profoundly altering the structure and content of consciousness. We've learned about the different states of consciousness and how they're reflected in brain activity. In waking consciousness, your brain shows a pattern of electrical activity called desynchronized high-frequency oscillation. Different brain regions are communicating rapidly, producing the alert, integrated consciousness of your normal waking state. As you drift into light sleep, these oscillations slow down. Theta waves emerge, with a frequency of about 4 to 8 cycles per second. Your consciousness becomes dreamlike, fragmented. In deeper sleep, even slower delta waves dominate, with frequencies below 4 cycles per second. In this state, consciousness typically disappears entirely, but interestingly, it can return in REM sleep when you dream. During REM sleep, your brain activity actually looks quite similar to waking consciousness. High-frequency, desynchronized oscillations. Your eyes move rapidly beneath your closed lids. Your body is paralyzed to prevent you from acting out your dream, and you experience vivid, often bizarre conscious experiences. Dreams are fascinating from the perspective of consciousness, because they show that you don't need sensory input to have rich conscious experiences. Your brain can generate an entire world on its own. We've also learned about what happens in various disorders of consciousness. In a coma, a person is completely unconscious, eyes closed, unresponsive. Brain activity is severely depressed. This is usually temporary, lasting days or weeks. Then there's the vegetative state, where a person's eyes may open, they may have sleep-wake cycles, but there's no sign of awareness, no conscious experience. In a minimally conscious state, there are fluctuating signs of awareness. The person might sometimes respond to commands, track objects with their eyes, show appropriate emotional responses. But consciousness is severely impaired, inconsistent. Perhaps most tragic is locked-in syndrome. Here, consciousness is fully intact. The person is aware, thinking, feeling, but they can't move or speak because of damage to motor pathways in the brainstem. They can sometimes communicate through eye movements. From the outside, they might look unconscious or vegetative, but inside they're completely conscious, trapped in a body that won't respond. This condition shows how important it is to carefully assess consciousness. What looks like unconsciousness from the outside might conceal a fully conscious person. These clinical conditions have driven the development of new methods for detecting conscious techniques like measuring how the brain responds to magnetic stimulation, or analyzing the complexity of EEG signals. Researchers are working to build objective measures that can tell us whether someone is conscious, even when they can't communicate. This has profound ethical implications for medical care, for decisions about life support, for our obligations to people who appear unresponsive. All of this neuroscientific knowledge is remarkable. In just a few decades, we've gone from almost complete ignorance about the brain basis of consciousness to a detailed understanding of the neural systems involved, the patterns of activity that correlate with consciousness, the ways consciousness can be altered or lost. And this knowledge continues to grow exponentially. New techniques, new theories, new discoveries are being published constantly. And this is important, all of this still leaves the hard problem untapped. We can map every neuron, trace every signal, measure every chemical, and we still wouldn't have explained why any of it should give rise to subjective experience. We'd have an incredibly detailed picture of the neural correlates of consciousness. But correlation, as they say, is not explanation. We'd know what consciousness depends on, but not why it exists at all. And yet knowing these correlations is valuable. It's the foundation for understanding consciousness. Even if it's not the complete explanation, it's like understanding the physics of sound waves and the anatomy of the ear, without quite explaining why sound feels the way it does. It's incomplete, but it's not nothing, it's progress. And for now, perhaps that's the best we can.
Theories of consciousness. Scientists and philosophers don't just catalog correlations, they build theories, frameworks for understanding consciousness in a deeper, more principled way. And there are now several major theories competing to explain consciousness, each with its own insights and limitations. Let's explore some of them as you continue to relax, letting these ideas wash over you like gentle waves. We've already touched on global workspace theory and integrated information theory, but let's delve a bit deeper. Global workspace theory, remember, suggests that consciousness is like information on a brightly lit stage broadcast to the entire theater of the mind. This theory emerged from cognitive science and computer science. Bernard Baars, who developed it, was thinking about how different mental modules could work together, how information from one part of the mind could become available to many other parts. The appeal of this theory is that it explains some key features of consciousness. Consciousness is limited in capacity. You can only hold a few things in consciousness at once. This makes sense if consciousness is a broadcast system. There's only so much that can be on stage at any given time. Consciousness is also sequential. You consciously experience one thing after another, not many things simultaneously. Again, this fits the theater metaphor. Only one act can be on stage at a time. And consciousness has a mobilizing effect. When information becomes conscious, it influences many different systems: your behavior, your speech, your memory, your reasoning. Because it's been broadcast, it's available to all these systems. Stanislas Dehaene and his colleagues have developed this into a neurobiological theory they call the global neuronal workspace theory. They've identified specific brain networks that might constitute this workspace, particularly connections between the prefrontal cortex and various sensory and motor regions. They've shown that when information becomes conscious, there's a sudden ignition of activity across these networks. Neural signals that were initially local and weak suddenly amplify and spread throughout the cortex. This ignition is what marks the transition from unconscious to conscious processing. They've tested this theory with clever experiments. For example, they present visual stimuli very briefly, so brief that sometimes people see them and sometimes they don't, even though the physical stimulus is identical. By comparing brain activity on trials where the stimulus is seen versus trials where it's not seen, they can identify what's different. And what they find is consistent with the theory. Conscious perception is associated with widespread sustained activation across frontal and parietal regions, while unconscious perception involves only brief localized activity in sensory areas. Integrated information theory, or IIT, takes a very different approach. Developed by Giulio Tononi and his collaborators, it starts not with brain function but with the properties of experience itself. What are the essential features of any conscious experience? According to IIT, conscious experiences are intrinsic, existing for themselves, not for external observers. Compositional, containing many distinguished parts. Informative, each experience is distinct from all other possible experiences. Integrated, unified, not divisible into independent parts. And definite, having precise boundaries and grain. From these phenomenological observations, IIT derives mathematical postulates about what kind of physical systems could support consciousness. The key concept is integrated information, measured by a system has high phi if its parts are both differentiated, capable of being in many different states, and integrated, strongly interdependent, so that the state of one part affects the states of others. Conscious experiences, according to IIT, are identical to the cause-effect structure of physical systems with high phi. This is a radical claim. It's not just saying that consciousness correlates with integrated information or that integrated information is a sign of consciousness. It's saying consciousness is integrated information. They are one and the same thing. If this is right, it means we can in principle calculate exactly how conscious any physical system is just by analyzing its causal structure. We could measure the consciousness of a brain, or an ant, or a computer, or even a collection of logic gates. IIT makes some surprising prediction. For instance, it predicts that the cerebellum, despite having more neurons than the cerebral cortex, contributes little to consciousness because its structure is highly modular. Different parts work independently, so integration is low. It also predicts that some artificial systems, even simple ones, might have small amounts of consciousness if they have the right structure, while other artificial systems, even very complex ones like digital computers, might have zero consciousness if their information doesn't integrate in the right way. Critics of IIT have pointed out various problems. The phi measure is computationally intensive to calculate for large systems, making it impractical to directly test the theory on actual brain. The theory also seems to imply panpsychism, that consciousness is everywhere, even in simple physical systems, which many find counterintuitive. And some argue that IIT still doesn't really solve the hard problem. It tells us that consciousness is integrated information, but it doesn't explain why integrated information should feel like anything. It doesn't bridge the explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience. There are other theories too. The higher-order thought theory suggests that what makes a mental state conscious is that it's accompanied by a thought about that mental state. You're consciously seeing red only if you're also thinking about the fact that you're seeing red. This explains why consciousness seems to involve a kind of self-awareness, a knowing that you're experiencing something. But critics point out that this seems to require an infinite regress. If you need a thought about your experience to be conscious, what about that thought itself? Does it need to be thought about too? The recurrent processing theory, championed by Victor Lama and others, suggests that consciousness arises from recurrent feedback loops in the cortex. When information flows not just forward through the brain but also backward, creating loops of processing, that's when consciousness emerges. This theory has some empirical brain imaging studies show that conscious perception is indeed associated with recurrent activity between higher and lower levels of the visual cortex, while unconscious perception involves only feed-forward activity. There's also the predictive processing framework,
which has become increasingly influential. According to this view, the brain is constantly generating predictions about incoming sensory information and comparing those predictions to actual consciousness. In this framework, might be related to the brain's models of the world and itself. Your conscious experience is the brain's best guess about what's out there and what's happening inside you. This framework connects consciousness to other aspects of brain function like perception, action, and learning in interesting ways. Some researchers have tried to directly compare these theories by designing experiments that make different predictions according to different theories. This is challenging, because the theories are often vague about exact predictions, or they make similar predictions for most cases, while differing only in edge cases. But there have been some attempts. The Cogitate Consortium, for instance, has been conducting large-scale studies designed to test predictions from global neuronal workspace theory against integrated information theory. Initial results from these adversarial collaborations have been interesting, but not conclusive. Some predictions have been confirmed, others not. Both theories capture some aspects of consciousness, but may be incomplete. This suggests that consciousness might not be explained by a single mechanism or principle. Different aspects of consciousness, its contents, its level, its unity, its subjectivity might have different explanations. The theories we have might each be describing different parts of the elephant, so to speak, and there are radically different approaches to. Some philosophers and scientists have suggested that we need to expand physics itself to include consciousness. Rather than trying to explain consciousness in terms of current physical theory, maybe we need a new physics that includes conscious experience as a fundamental property, like mass or charge. This is the view of philosophers like David Chalmers and scientists like Roger Penrose, who has proposed that consciousness might be related to quantum processes in the brain. Penrose, working with anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, has developed what they call orchestrated objective reduction, or ORC. According to this theory, consciousness arises from quantum computations in tiny structures called microtubules inside neurons. These quantum processes, they suggest, are what give rise to the unity and binding of consciousness. Most neuroscientists are skeptical of this theory, arguing that the brain is too warm and wet for quantum effects to survive long enough to be relevant. But Penrose and Hameroff argue that biological systems might have ways of protecting quantum coherence. Then there are theories that question whether consciousness is a natural kind at all. Some philosophers like Daniel Dennett have argued that our intuitions about consciousness are confused, that the hard problem is a pseudo-problem created by mistaken assumption. According to Dennett, when we properly understand the various cognitive functions that create the illusion of consciousness, attention, memory, verbal report, self-monitoring, there's nothing left over to explain. Consciousness isn't a special, mysterious property. It's just the brain doing what the brain does, and our sense that there's something more is a kind of cognitive trick we play on ourselves. Critics of Dennett argue that he's eliminating the very phenomenon we want to explain. Saying that consciousness is an illusion doesn't help if consciousness is the very capacity to experience illusions. As philosopher Galen Strawson put it, if it seems to you that you're conscious, then you are conscious. The seeming is the reality. You can't be mistaken about whether you're having experiences, even if you might be mistaken about the nature of those experiences. These theoretical debates can seem abstract, but they matter. They shape how we approach the science of consciousness, what experiments we do, what we look for, and they have practical implications. If IIT is right, we might be able to build consciousness meters that objectively measure how conscious a system is. If global workspace theory is right, we might be able to create conscious AI by implementing the right kind of broadcast architecture. If Dennett is right, there might be no hard problem to solve at all, and we should just focus on understanding the functional architecture of the brain. What's becoming clear is that consciousness is not one thing, it's many things. There's the difference between being conscious and being unconscious, what's sometimes called level or state of consciousness. There's the specific contents of consciousness, what you're conscious of at any given moment. There's the unity of consciousness, the fact that your various experiences seem bound together into a single unified field. There's the subjectivity of consciousness, the fact that it's experienced from a particular point of view. There's self-consciousness, being aware of yourself as a distinct entity. Each of these might have different neural bases and different explanations.
And perhaps different theories are better at explaining different aspects. Global workspace theory might explain the contents of consciousness well. Integrated information theory might capture something important about the unity of consciousness. Higher order theories might explain self-consciousness. We might need multiple theoretical frameworks, not a single grand unified theory. Or maybe we're still missing something fundamental. Maybe consciousness requires a conceptual revolution we haven't had yet, similar to how quantum mechanics revolutionized physics in the early 20th century. Before quantum mechanics, there were phenomena that seemed completely mysterious from the perspective of classical physics. No amount of refinement of classical theory could explain them. What was needed was a radically new framework. Perhaps consciousness is like that. Perhaps we're still waiting for our quantum revolution in consciousness science. As these theories swirl in your mind, perhaps you can feel your own consciousness beginning to loosen, to become less focused, more dreamlike. The boundaries between different thoughts becoming blurry, the sense of self becoming less distinct. This is consciousness in transition, moving from the tight, focused awareness of full wakefulness toward the diffuse, formless awareness of sleep. Even this process is mysterious. How does consciousness fade? Does it go gradually or in discrete steps? What's the last conscious experience before sleep claims you completely? You won't know. You can't know. Because to know it, you'd have to be conscious, and then it wouldn't be the last experience. The moment of falling asleep is forever hidden from your awareness, knowable only from the outside, never from the inside. Qualia, the essence of experience. Let's turn now to one of the most intimate and puzzling aspects of consciousness, qualia. The word itself sounds almost musical, doesn't it? Qualia. It's the plural of quali, a term borrowed from Latin meaning of what kind or of what sort. In philosophy, qualia refers to the subjective, qualitative properties of experiences, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the sweetness of sugar, the sound of a violin. These are qualia. They're what make your experiences feel the way they do. Right now you're experiencing many qualia. Perhaps the softness of your pillow against your cheek, the weight of your blanket, the sound of my voice. Each of these sensations has a distinctive qualitative character. There's something it's like to feel that softness, to hear that sound. And this something its likeness is what philosophers mean when they talk about qualia. It's the felt quality of experience, the subjective feel of mental states. Qualia are fundamental to consciousness. They're what make consciousness rather than just information processing. A computer can process information about color. It can detect wavelengths of light, categorize them, respond appropriately. But there's presumably nothing it's like to be that computer processing that information. It doesn't experience the redness of red. It's all dark inside. There are no qualia in a computer, or at least that's what most of us assume. And this absence of qualia is what makes it seem empty, unconscious, not really experiencing anything despite all its sophisticated processing. Philosophers have spilled enormous amounts of ink trying to understand what qualia are and how they relate to physical processes in the brain. Are qualia physical properties? Are they identical to certain neural states? Or are they something else, something beyond the physics? These questions are at the heart of the mind-body problem, the question of how mind and matter relate. Some philosophers argue that qualia are fundamentally private and ineffable. Private, because you can never directly share your qualia with anyone. I can't experience your experience of redness. I can only experience my own. And ineffable because qualia seem to resist being fully captured in words. How do you describe what red looks like to someone who has never seen red? You can point to red things, but that just shows them which things cause the experience. It doesn't convey what the experience itself is like. The quality of the experience seems to escape linguistic description. This privacy and ineffability have led some philosophers to doubt whether we can have genuine knowledge of other people's qualia. How do you know that what you experience when you see red is the same as what I experience when I see red? We both learn to call the same things red by ostension, by being shown red objects, and learning to apply the word red to them. But that process of learning doesn't guarantee that our inner experiences are the same. Your red might look like my green, and vice versa. As long as we use the words consistently, both calling strawberries and fire trucks red, we'd never know our qualia were inverted. This thought experiment, called the inverted spectrum, has been discussed since at least John Locke in the 17th century. If spectrum inversion is possible, if two people could have systematically different qualia while behaving identically, that would suggest that qualia are distinct from functional or behavioral property. It would be a problem for functionalism, the view that mental states are defined by their functional roles rather than by their intrinsic qualities. But some philosophers have argued that spectrum inversion isn't really possible. They claim that the quality of an experience is tied to its functional role in complex ways. If your red experience was really like my green experience, it would have different connections to other experiences, different associations, different effects on your behavior and thinking. So perfect spectrum inversion, they argue, is conceptually impossible. This is still debated, but the very fact that we can have this debate, that we can conceive of spectrum inversion and argue about whether it's possible, shows how puzzling qualia are. Another famous thought experiment about qualia is the one we mentioned earlier, Mary's room, devised by philosopher Frank Jackson. Remember Mary, the brilliant neuroscientist who knows everything physical there is to know about color vision but has never experienced color because she's lived her whole life in a black and white room. When Mary finally leaves her room and sees red for the first time, she seems to learn something new. She gains knowledge of what it's like to see red, but all the physical facts were already known to her. She knew which wavelengths of light red objects reflect, how those wavelengths affect the eye, what neural processes occur in the brain during color perception. If she learns something new upon seeing red, that new knowledge must not be physical knowledge. It must be knowledge of a non-physical fact, the qualia of redness itself. This is sometimes called the knowledge argument. It's an argument that qualia are not physical properties.
that physicalism, the view that everything is physical, is false. Not everyone accepts this argument, of course. Some philosophers, called physicalists, insist that Mary doesn't really learn a new fact. She just comes to know an old fact, that certain neural processes occur when seeing red in a new way. It's like the difference between knowing about someone through description versus meeting them in person. You don't learn new facts about them. You just relate to the same facts differently. Other physicalists argue that Mary does learn something new, but what she learns is a new ability or skill, the ability to recognize and imagine red, not a new propositional fact. These responses try to deflect the knowledge argument without abandoning physicalism. Whether they succeed is still debated. But the intuition behind the knowledge argument is powerful. There does seem to be something about the qualitative character of experience, the qualia, that eludes capture in purely physical or functional terms. And this intuition is what drives much of the philosophy of mind. Some philosophers have tried to deny that qualia exist at all, or at least to deny that they have the special properties usually attributed to them. Daniel Dennett, the philosopher we mentioned earlier, has famously tried to queen qualia, to eliminate them from our ontology, to show that they're an illusion or a confusion. He argues that our intuitions about qualia are based on mistaken assumptions about consciousness. When we properly understand how the brain works, he claims, the idea of qualia as intrinsic, ineffable, private properties will disappear. But many philosophers and scientists find this hard to swallow. As they point out, if qualia are an illusion, what is experiencing the illusion? To have an illusion, you need consciousness. You need there to be something it's like to be fooled. So qualia, or at least some form of subjective experience, seem ineliminable. You can't coherently deny that you're having experiences when the very act of denying it is itself an experience. Neuroscience has begun to study qualia empirically, though it's challenging given their subjective nature. One approach is to use binocular rivalry. If you show different images to each eye, say a red vertical stripe to the left eye and a green horizontal stripe to the right eye, your conscious perception will alternate. Sometimes you'll see the red stripe, sometimes the green stripe. Your eyes are receiving constant input, but your qualia are changing. By comparing brain activity when you're consciously seeing red versus green, neuroscientists can try to identify the neural correlates of these specific qualia. Studies like this have found that activity in certain brain regions correlates with specific qualitative experiences. For instance, different patterns of activity in visual cortex correspond to different colors. Different patterns in auditory cortex correspond to different sound. This is progress. It tells us something about where qualia come from, at least in a correlational sense, but it still doesn't explain why these neural patterns should feel like anything. Why should a certain pattern of neural firing be experienced as redness rather than greenness or than nothing at all? This explanatory gap remains. And for some philosophers, it suggests that qualia are fundamentally different from physical property. They point to what's called the conceivability of zombies. A philosophical zombie, remember, is a being that's physically identical to a conscious person but lacks qualia. There's nothing it's like to be a zombie. Now, whether zombies are metaphysically possible, whether they could actually exist in reality, is controversial, but they seem conceivable. We can imagine them without contradiction. And some philosophers argue that conceivability is a guide to possibility, that if we can conceive of zombies, they must be possible in some sense, which means consciousness can't be identical to any physical property. Other philosophers respond that conceivability is not always a reliable guide to possibility. We can conceive of water not being H2O, but that doesn't mean it's possible for water to not be H2O. Once we discovered that water is H2O, it became a necessary truth. Similarly, perhaps consciousness is identical to certain physical states, and we only think we can conceive of zombies because we don't yet fully understand this identity. This debate gets very technical, involving careful distinctions between different kinds of possibility and conceivability, but it all circles around the status of qualia and their relationship to the physical world.
Some philosophers and scientists have embraced panpsychism as a way to address the problem of qualia. According to panpsychism, consciousness or something like it is a fundamental feature of reality, present even in the most basic physical entities, electrons, quarks, maybe even space-time itself has some kind of primitive experiential quality. Complex conscious experiences, like yours, emerge from the combination and organization of these simpler experiential properties. Human qualia are what it's like to be a complex integration of many simpler proto-qualia. This might sound strange, but it has some appeal. It avoids the hard problem by denying that qualia emerge from non-experiential matter. Instead, experience is there all along, in some form. And what changes is just its complexity and organization. But panpsychism faces its own challenges. How exactly do simple experiences combine to form complex experience? Why should my neurons' micro-experiences, if they have them, combine to form my macro-experience rather than remaining separate? This is called the combination problem, and it's been a major focus of recent panpsychist philosophy. Despite all these debates, qualia remain central to consciousness. They're what consciousness is made of, in a sense. Every conscious experience has its distinctive qualitative character. The feeling of confusion as you try to understand these philosophical puzzles is a qualia. The slight drowsiness you might be feeling now is a qualia. The comfort of lying in bed, the warmth of your blanket, the darkness behind your closed eyelids, all qualia. They're the fabric of your inner life. And yet they remain deeply mysterious. We experience them constantly, intimately, but we can't quite say what they are or how they arise from the physical brain. Perhaps this mystery is appropriate. Perhaps qualia are meant to be experienced rather than explained. The taste of chocolate isn't captured by any description of it, no matter how detailed. You have to taste it yourself. The beauty of a sunset isn't in the wavelengths of light or the atmospheric scattering. It's in the experience in the qualia. And maybe that experiential reality is primary, more fundamental than any third-person scientific description could be. As you drift towards sleep, your qualia are shifting, transforming. The clear, distinct experiences of wakefulness are becoming fuzzy, dreamlike. New qualia are emerging, the strange, fleeting images and thoughts of hypnagogia, the transitional state between waking and sleeping. Soon perhaps qualia will disappear entirely into dreamless sleep. Your consciousness will cease, and all these questions, all these puzzles will dissolve into the nothingness of deep sleep. But for now, in this gentle fading of awareness, the mystery of qualia remains, the inexplicable wonder of experience, the evolution of consciousness. Let's turn now to a different kind of question. Not what is consciousness, but where did it come from? When did consciousness first appear in the history of life on Earth? Which animals are conscious? Did consciousness emerge suddenly at some point, Or has it been gradually increasing in complexity over millions of years? These are questions about the evolution of consciousness, and they're just as puzzling as the questions about its nature. Evolution is one of science's greatest achievements. The theory of evolution by natural selection, first proposed by Charles Darwin, explains the origin and diversity of life. It explains why organisms have the features they do, why they're adapted to their environments, why some species are related to others. But consciousness seems to pose a special problem for evolution. How did natural selection produce subjective experience? First, consider a basic question. Why is consciousness adaptive? What evolutionary advantage does it confer? On the face of it, consciousness seems almost superfluous. Imagine a creature that behaves exactly like you in every way but without any subjective experience. It responds to stimuli, avoids danger, seeks food, reproduces. It's a biological robot, a zombie. From an evolutionary perspective, this zombie should be just as successful as a conscious creature. Both leave the same number of offspring. So why did consciousness evolve? This is sometimes called the paradox of consciousness. If behavior can be explained purely in terms of physical causes, neurons firing, muscles contracting, hormones releasing, then consciousness seems to be epiphenomenal, a mere side effect that doesn't do any actual work. And natural selection can't favor side effects that don't contribute to fitness. So how did consciousness evolve? One response is to deny that consciousness is epiphenomenal. Consciousness must make a difference to behavior, or it wouldn't exist. Perhaps conscious experiences play a causal role that unconscious processing can't. Perhaps consciousness allows for more flexible, creative responses to novel situations. Perhaps it enables long-term planning, abstract reasoning, social cooperation. There's something that consciousness enables, some advantage it provides, and that's why it evolved. But what exactly is this advantage? That's less clear. Some theorists have suggested that consciousness is necessary for integrating information from different sensory modalities, binding together the sights, sounds, smells, touches into a unified experience. Others suggest that consciousness is needed for certain types of learning or memory. Still others think consciousness is crucial for metacognition, for thinking about your own thoughts, monitoring your own mental states. Each of these proposals has some plausibility, but also faces challenges. Another approach is to think about when consciousness first appeared. Did it emerge early in the history of life? Or is it relatively recent? Is it widespread in the animal kingdom, or restricted to a few species? Philosophers and scientists have proposed wildly different answers to these questions. Some, like neuroscientist Bjorn Merker and philosophers Simona Ginsberg and Eva Jablonka, argue that consciousness is evolutionarily ancient, perhaps as old as 500 million years. They point to the Cambrian explosion, that period around 540 million years ago, when complex animal life diversified rapidly. This was when animals first evolved sophisticated sensory systems, centralized nervous systems, and complex behavior. According to this view, consciousness emerged then, perhaps as a way to coordinate behavior and navigate the environment. They point to evidence that even relatively simple animals show signs of consciousness. Insects, for instance, can learn, remember, make decisions, respond flexibly to novel situations. They have centralized nervous systems that integrate sensory information. They show what appears to be goal-directed behavior. All of this, proponents of early evolution argue, suggests conscious experience, an insect navigating its environment, seeking food,
avoiding predators. It seems like there's something it's like to be that insect. Some felt quality to its experience. Others are more conservative. Neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux, for instance, argues that consciousness requires cortical re-representation, the ability to think about one's own experiences. This, he suggests, is only found in mammals and perhaps birds, animals with complex cortical structure. On this view, consciousness is a relatively late development, perhaps only 100 or 200 million years old. Fish, reptiles, amphibians, insects, they're all unconscious, Ledoux argues, sophisticated biological robots, but without inner experience. Still others, like philosopher Ned Block, distinguish between different kinds of consciousness. Perhaps phenomenal consciousness, the raw feeling of experience, is widespread and ancient, but access consciousness, the ability to report on and think about one's experiences, is more recent. So an insect might have simple phenomenal consciousness, qualia of a basic sort, but not the higher order reflective consciousness that humans have. These debates are difficult to resolve because we can't directly observe consciousness in other animals. We can only infer it from behavior and brain structure, and different people weigh the evidence differently. If an animal behaves in ways that would indicate consciousness in a human, learning, responding flexibly, seeking rewards, avoiding punishments, does that mean it's conscious? Or might it be doing all this unconsciously, without any felt experience? The challenge is particularly acute for animals very different from us. When we think about other mammals, dogs, cats, monkeys, we're fairly confident they're conscious. They have similar brain structures to us. They show similar behaviors. It seems reasonable to attribute consciousness to them. But what about fish? Fish have much simpler brains, no cortex at all, yet they can learn, remember, show signs of fear and pain. Are they conscious? What about octopuses? Octopuses are invertebrates, very distantly related to us, with a completely different brain organization, yet they're remarkably intelligent, capable of complex problem solving, showing apparent curiosity and playfulness, conscious or not. And what about an insect brain has maybe 1 million neurons, compared to about 86 billion in a human brain. Is that enough for consciousness? Or what about something even simpler, like a flatworm with a few thousand neurons, or a roundworm, like elegans, which has exactly 302 neurons, each one individually mapped? Where's the threshold? How many neurons do you need for consciousness? Or is it not about the number of neurons, but their organization?
These aren't just abstract philosophical questions. They have real ethical implications. If fish are conscious and can feel pain, then fishing and fish farming raise serious animal welfare concerns. If insects are conscious, then pest control and the use of insects in research become morally fraught. If octopuses are conscious, and indeed many countries now legally recognize them as sentient beings, then keeping them in aquariums or using them in experiments requires special ethical justification. Recently, there have been significant scientific and political developments in this area. The New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, signed by prominent scientists and philosophers in 2024, stated that there's strong evidence for consciousness in mammals and birds, substantial evidence for consciousness in reptiles, fish, and cephalopods, like octopuses, and realistic possibility of consciousness even in insects. This represents a shift toward attributing consciousness more widely in the animal kingdom than was common a few decades ago. But how did consciousness evolve? What were the intermediate steps? Evolution proceeds gradually, by small modifications to existing structures and functions, but consciousness seems like an all or nothing thing. You're either conscious or you're not. How do you evolve from non-consciousness to consciousness in small steps? One possibility is that consciousness isn't all or nothing. Maybe there are degrees of consciousness. Very simple organisms might have very simple, dim forms of consciousness. As nervous systems became more complex, consciousness became richer, clearer, more sophisticated. On this view, consciousness didn't suddenly appear at some point in evolution. It's been there all along in some form, gradually intensifying and complexifying. This connects to panpsychism, the view we discussed earlier. If even simple physical systems have some form of proto-experience, then biological evolution isn't creating consciousness from nothing. It's organizing and integrating pre-existing experiential properties in new ways. The evolutionary question becomes not, how did consciousness arise, but how did it become so rich and complex? But even if we accept gradualism, there are puzzles. What evolutionary pressures drove the development of more complex consciousness? What advantages did richer subjective experience confer? And at what point did different aspects of consciousness, qualia, unity, self-awareness emerge? Some theorists have suggested that consciousness co-evolved with other cognitive abilities. Nicholas Humphrey, for instance, has argued that consciousness evolved in social contexts. Being conscious of your own mental states allows you to model other individuals' mental state. If you can introspect and know what you're feeling, thinking, intending, then you can use that knowledge to predict what others might be feeling, thinking, intending. This would be enormously useful in social species, enabling cooperation, competition, communication. On this view, consciousness is fundamentally social. It evolved to help us navigate the social world. Others have linked consciousness to action and motor control. Rodolfo Llinás and others have suggested that consciousness evolved in organisms that move actively through their environment. A sessile organism, rooted in place, might not need consciousness. It can respond to local stimuli with simple reflexes. But an organism that moves needs to coordinate sensory input with motor output, to predict the sensory consequences of its actions, to plan and navigate. This might require a centralized system that integrates information and creates a unified representation of the world and the self within it. Consciousness on this view is essentially motile. It's about action and movement. Still others emphasize memory and learning. Perhaps consciousness evolved to enable more flexible learning. Unconscious organisms can learn through simple conditioning, but conscious organisms might be able to learn more complex relationships, remember specific episodes, plan for the future. Episodic memory, the ability to mentally re-experience past events, might be particularly linked to consciousness. Each of these proposals has some explanatory power, but none is fully satisfying. The truth is, we don't know exactly why or how consciousness evolved. We can speculate based on comparative neuroscience, based on what we know about the cognitive abilities of different species, based on theoretical considerations about what consciousness might be good for. But the origin of consciousness remains obscure, lost in the deep history of life. What we can say is that consciousness is now a widespread feature of animal life, at least in its simpler forms. Many animals, probably most vertebrates, and perhaps many invertebrates too, have some form of subjective experience. The world is full of consciousness, of felt experience, not just in humans but in countless other creatures. Each animal in its own way experiences the world from within. There's something it's like to be a bird, to be a fish, to be perhaps even a bee. And this is humbling. For much of human history we've seen ourselves as special, uniquely endowed with minds and souls, while other creatures were mere automata. But evolutionary biology teaches us continuity. We're not separate from nature, we're part of it. Our consciousness didn't come from nowhere. It evolved gradually from simpler forms, and those simpler forms still exist in the vast diversity of conscious creatures that share this planet with us. As your own consciousness dims towards sleep, you're recapitulating, in a way, billions of years of evolution. From the bright, wakeful consciousness of modern humans, through drowsiness, into sleep, into unconsciousness. The complexity of consciousness waxing and waning, as it has waxed and waned countless times through evolutionary history. And in the morning, consciousness will return, the lights will come back on, and the evolutionary miracle will continue. For now, though, let yourself drift in this ancient rhythm, this ebb and flow of awareness that connects you to the deep history of life. The unanswered questions. We've journeyed through the landscape of consciousness. We've explored the hard problem, examined the neural correlates, considered competing theories, pondered qualia, and traced the evolutionary history. But for all this exploration, the central mystery remains. We still don't really know what consciousness is or why it exists. The hard problem stands as resistant to solution now as it was when David Chalmers first articulated it. Science has made incredible progress on the correlates of consciousness. We know so much about which brain regions are involved, what patterns of neural activity accompany different conscious states, how consciousness can be altered by drugs or damaged by injury. We can predict to some extent when someone will be conscious, based on their brain activity. We can even decode some aspects of conscious content from neural signals. But knowing the correlates isn't the same as explaining consciousness itself. We still face that explanatory gap. Why should any physical process, no matter how complex, no matter how integrated, be accompanied by subjective experience? Why should there be anything it's like to be a brain processing information? These questions remain unanswered. Some scientists and philosophers think we'll eventually solve the hard problem. They believe that as neuroscience advances, as our theories become more sophisticated, we'll find a way to bridge the explanatory gap. Perhaps there's a conceptual breakthrough waiting, similar to how quantum mechanics revolutionized physics. Perhaps we just need the right framework, the right way of thinking about the problem, and then everything will click into place. Others are more pessimistic. They think the hard problem might be permanently beyond our reach, not because we're not smart enough, but because of fundamental limitations in human cognition. Colin McGinn, for instance, has argued for what he calls Mysterianism, the view that consciousness is a mystery that human minds are constitutionally incapable of solving. Just as a dog can't understand quantum mechanics, we might not be able to understand consciousness, even our own. This might sound defeatist, but McGinn argues it's actually realistic. Every species has cognitive limitations. There are things that lie forever beyond the grasp of any given cognitive system. For humans, consciousness might be one of those things. We can study its correlates. We can build theories about its functions. We can make progress on the easy problems. But the hard problem, the question of why there's subjective experience at all, might be permanently closed to us. Other mysteries remain too.
How does the unity of consciousness arise? Your experience right now is unified. You're not having separate visual experiences, auditory experiences, tactile experiences happening in parallel. You're having one integrated experience that includes all these modalities, but the brain processes these modalities in different regions. Visual information is processed in the visual cortex, auditory information in the auditory cortex, and so on. So how do these separate processes bind together into a single unified experience? This is called the binding problem. And while neuroscientists have made progress on it, it's not fully solved. There are proposals involving synchronized neural oscillations, different brain regions firing in sync to bind their processing together. There's evidence that consciousness requires widespread communication between different brain areas, but we still don't fully understand how the brain creates the phenomenal unity of consciousness from its anatomically distributed process. There's also the question of the neural substrate of consciousness. We know the cortex is important, but how important? Can you have consciousness without a cortex? What about animals that lack cortices entirely, like fish or octopus? They have completely different brain organizations, yet they might be conscious. Does this mean consciousness can be realized in very different types of neural systems? And if so, what's the common factor? What's essential for consciousness? And what's incidental? And then there's the question of artificial consciousness. As we build more sophisticated artificial intelligence systems, will we eventually create conscious machines? Is consciousness something that could be implemented in silicon, or does it require biological neurons? Could a sufficiently complex computer program be conscious? Could a large language model, trained on vast amounts of text, develop subjective experience? These aren't just philosophical questions. They're becoming practical as AI systems become more capable. Some researchers think artificial consciousness is possible in principle. If consciousness is fundamentally about information processing, about integration, about global availability, about the right kind of computational architecture, then there's no reason it couldn't be realized in artificial systems. We just need to figure out the right architecture, the right kind of processing, and implement it. Others are skeptical. They think biological brains have properties that are essential for consciousness, properties that couldn't be replicated in digital computing. Maybe it's the analog continuous nature of neural processing. Maybe it's the chemical signaling between neurons. Maybe it's quantum effects. Whatever it is, it's something that silicon lacks. On this view, we'll never create genuinely conscious AI, no matter how sophisticated our software becomes. And of course, there's the question of how we would know if we had created a conscious machine. The machine can't just tell us. A sophisticated AI system might claim to be conscious, might pass any behavioral test we give it, but that wouldn't prove it actually has subjective experience. It might just be simulating consciousness without experiencing anything. This is the zombie problem again, but now applied to machines instead of hypothetical beings. There are also deep questions about the relationship between consciousness and time. Your conscious experience seems to unfold in time, moment by moment. But what is the moment of consciousness? How long is the psychological present? Is consciousness fundamentally temporal, or does time emerge from consciousness? And what about memory? When you remember a past experience, are you re-experiencing the original qualia, or are you having new qualia that represent the past? These questions about the temporal structure of consciousness remain largely unexplored, And what about the sense of most of our discussion has focused on what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness, the qualitative feel of experience. But there's also self-consciousness, being aware of yourself as a distinct entity, as the subject of your experiences. Where does this sense of self come from? Is it a fundamental feature of consciousness, or does it emerge from more basic processes? Some meditative traditions claim you can have consciousness without a sense of self, that the self is actually an illusion constructed by the mind. Is that what would consciousness without self be like? These questions multiply the more you think about them. Consciousness is like an onion. Every layer you peel back reveals another layer beneath, and perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps consciousness, being the most intimate and immediate aspect of our existence, should also be the most mysterious. Perhaps there's a kind of fittingness to the fact that the one thing we know most directly, our own subjective experience, is also the thing we understand. Science has given us incredible knowledge about the external world, about the universe of matter and energy, but it has so far given us relatively little insight into the internal world, the universe of experience. And maybe that's telling us something. Maybe consciousness requires a different kind of approach, not the third-person perspective of objective science, but a first-person investigation, a phenomenology, an exploration of experience from within. Or maybe consciousness will eventually yield to scientific investigation, but it will require patience, creativity, and perhaps conceptual breakthroughs we can't yet imagine. The history of science is full of problems that seemed insoluble until suddenly they were. Vitalism, the idea that life requires a special vital force, seemed reasonable until we understood biochemistry. The idea that we could never know what stars are made of seemed obvious until we developed spectroscopy. Maybe the hard problem of consciousness will be similar. Maybe future scientists will look back and wonder what all the fuss was about. But for now, in this moment, as you lie here in the quiet darkness, consciousness remains mysterious. The fact that you're experiencing anything at all, that there's something it's like to be you, that the universe contains not just matter and energy, but also feeling and awareness. This remains unexplained, and perhaps that's okay. Perhaps mystery is part of what makes consciousness so precious. The fact that we can't fully explain it doesn't diminish it. If anything, it enhances it. It reminds us that we're in the presence of something profound, something that resists our usual categories and explanations. And as consciousness fades, as sleep approaches, the mystery deepens. Where does consciousness go when you sleep? Does it dissolve gradually, or vanish suddenly? Is there a last conscious moment, and if so, what is it like? You'll never know, because to know it would be to remain conscious, and then it wouldn't be the last moment. The edge of consciousness is forever hidden from consciousness itself. We can't see our own seeing, can't experience our own experiencing, except by having yet another experience. Consciousness is transparent to itself, both the most obvious thing in the world and the most elusive. Closing reflections. And so we come to the end of our journey. Though the mystery of consciousness continues, as it always has, as it perhaps always will, we've explored this most intimate phenomenon from many angles: philosophical, scientific, evolutionary, and found that for all our knowledge, the essential questions remain open. What is consciousness? Why does it exist? How does it arise from the physical brain? These questions echo unanswered into the night. But perhaps that's as it should be. Consciousness isn't just another phenomenon to be catalogued and explained. It's the very medium of our existence. It's what makes anything matter at all. Without consciousness, there would be no meaning, no value, no beauty, no love. There would be no one there for anything to be meaningful or valuable or beautiful or loving to. Consciousness is, in a very real sense, the light that illuminates the world, both the external world of objects and events, and the internal world of thoughts and feelings. And you are conscious. Right now in this moment, there's something it's like to be you. You're experiencing the sound of these words, the comfort of your bed, the gentle pull of sleep. These experiences are unique to you. No one else can have them. They're yours alone, private and immediate, the most personal thing about you. And yet they're also utterly mysterious. The fact that they exist at all, that subjective experience is woven into the fabric of reality, remains unexplained by science. This mystery isn't a failing, it's a feature. It's part of what makes consciousness so special. We live in a world explained by science, mapped by mathematics, reduced to physical laws and chemical reactions. And yet in the midst of all this mechanism, there's also meaning, there's also feeling, there's also the warm, immediate, irreducible fact of experience. You're not just a complicated biological machine, you're someone for whom things matter, someone who experiences the world from the inside, someone who has an inner life. As you drift into sleep, your consciousness will fade. The clarity and vividness of waking experience will soften, blur, dissolve. Thoughts will drift by without your direction. The sense of being a distinct self will loosen. You'll lose your grip on the world, and the world will lose its grip on you. And then if all goes well, there will be nothing. Not darkness, not silence, not void, but just nothing. An absence so complete that there's no one there to notice the absence. This nightly disappearance of consciousness is one of the strangest facts of existence. Every day, you cease to exist in any experiential sense. You become unconscious, and then miraculously, you return. Consciousness comes back, the lights come on, and you're you again, picking up the thread of your life where you left off. This cycle of presence and absence, of consciousness and unconsciousness, is the rhythm of your existence, and it's a reminder of the preciousness of consciousness. It's not guaranteed, it's not permanent, it comes and goes, fragile and contingent. But while you have it, consciousness is everything. It's the gift of being, of experiencing, of mattering and being mattered to. The fact that we can't fully explain it doesn't diminish this gift. If anything, it enhances it. Consciousness is the ground of all value, the condition of all meaning, the source of everything we care about, and it's yours right now in this moment, as surely as anything can be. So as you lie here, balanced on the edge between waking and sleeping, between consciousness and unconsciousness, perhaps you can appreciate the mystery and the miracle, the strange fact that you exist, that there's something it's like to be you, that the universe contains not just matter and energy, but also awareness and experience. Science may one day explain this, or perhaps it won't, but either way, the fact remains. You're conscious, you're here, you're experiencing this moment, and that perhaps is enough. The mystery doesn't need to be solved to be lived. Consciousness doesn't need to be explained to be experienced. The hard problem can remain hard, the questions can remain unanswered, and still you can lie here in the gentle darkness, feeling the weight of your body, hearing these words, drifting peacefully towards sleep, grateful for this inexplicable gift of awareness. The greatest mystery science can't explain is also the most familiar fact of your existence. Consciousness, the light within, the feeling of being, the what it's likeness of everything you've ever experienced, or ever will experience. It's yours, it's real, it's utterly mysterious, and it's fading now, softening into sleep, dissolving into the gentle darkness, where consciousness goes when it's done for the day. Rest well in this mystery, let go of the question, let consciousness do what it does every night: fade, dissolve, disappear, into the nowhere from which it came, and to which it will return. Tomorrow it will be back, as mysterious and miraculous as ever. But for now, just let it go. Let yourself drift. Let sleep come. Let consciousness, the greatest mystery of all, quietly take its leave. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the mystery of consciousness. If you enjoyed this exploration of science's deepest puzzle, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Science Lullaby for more soothing journeys through the wonders and mysteries of science. Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and when you wake, marvel at the miracle that you're there to wake at all.